staff. So shortages have played a particular role, certainly in the kinds of queues at security that you saw earlier on, hopefully beginning to improve.
Thank you. Oliver Richardson, is it as simple as to say we sacked a load of people during the pandemic and now we can't hire them back quick enough?
In one sense, yes. In another sense, it's more complex. And I think you heard from the previous witnesses, Simon Calder was saying that where you look at the league tables as who was worst in terms of cancellations and who were better in terms of airlines, it almost exactly corresponds with the companies that carried out the most redundancies and the most significant changes in terms of conditions and those that didn't. So, for example, Ryanair were very clear. We negotiated an agreement with them. The basis of the agreement were no redundancies. So they're in a different position from the likes of BA, who went through the fire and rehire, where not only did they lose 10,000 staff through redundancy, they also radically changed the terms and conditions. So they did get rid of too many people in a number of instances. The terms and conditions for those remaining were lessened. And then when it comes to attracting people to the industry, it simply isn't as attractive as it was. But I do think there are two other elements that have been critical. One was the lack of sector-specific support, so what the government didn't do. And again, the Transport Select Committee have covered that off. And the other piece is the economics of the industry. So the economics of the industry simply doesn't allow it to scale up to such an extent. So the industry is based on the sale of tickets. Once that revenue comes in, that's fine, you can scale up, but you need the revenue in. You don't have the access to liquidity to be able to scale up before that revenue comes in. So in a normal operating environment, 2, 3, 4% increase in passengers, that's fine, you can deal with that. But where you're looking at 30, 40% increase in passenger numbers, it's very difficult to get access to the kind of liquidity that you need to be able to bring people into the industry. So those are the three areas that I think are the problem for the industry at the moment.
Danny Brooks, just briefly from me, we're going to get all the money in from tickets. We want to hire back everyone we sacked. Do those people exist, or have they gone somewhere else?
And the large part have gone somewhere else. As a result of COVID, obviously there's a big aviation crisis in regard to skills. A lot of the workers were furloughed. The furlough came to an end in September last year. A lot of the aviation restrictions didn't lift till earlier this year. So there's a big disconnect in the period. So the airlines and the operators and everyone involved in the aviation supply chain had to protect themselves to survive to fight another day, which resulted in lots of redundancies. So BA laid off 10,000 people, EasyJet 5,000, I believe Swissport, a third of their workforce, 20,000. So these people have left the industry for good, for a number of reasons. Necessity. They've gone to competitive industries, maybe some of the things like Amazon warehouses for the lower skilled end. In terms of the skilled end, people becoming heating engineers, working in different industries. So it's almost like an alien spaceship has come along and taken several million people out of the aviation supply chain, but that's not the case. They've just gone into different areas and are reticent to come back because of boom bust cycles, because of the with regards to furlough, looking at the work-life balance. Aviation working is antisocial hours. They can earn comparative rates of pay with less responsibility. If you're signing off an aircraft or you're flying an aircraft, it's a huge responsibility and comes with it consequences if you don't do your job properly. You're working for an organisation that doesn't have those legal ramifications, less stress for similar pay. So fundamentally, a lot of people have left the industry, particularly with in COVID times, people have looked at retirement and early retirement. And then we cannot understate the fact that for 2 years in the COVID period, little or if any aviation training went on. And that means over a 30-year life cycle of a person working in aviation, that means we've lost 7% of the workforce already because they've not been backfilled. So yet there's, and the problems are compounded by the fact we've got Brexit into the mix. So as Simon said earlier on, the UK aviation sector is got a quite high proportion of migrant workers from Europe, and they've either left to go and work in Amazons or other organisations, or have gone back home and are enjoying working and living back home. They can't come back now very easily, so it's making it very difficult for them. So yeah, there's a myriad of different reasons. I've got a paper that I could pass around later on afterwards that I've done some work on if you want further detail.
That'd be great. Thank you very much. Mark Pawsey, please.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to follow on from what Danny was saying there about the workers who've left the sector. I mean, we heard from Simon Calder about 30% of the workforce in airports and airlines being East European. Many of those returned and haven't come back. But there's also some evidence of the over 50s having taken early retirement. How big an issue is that, Danny? Is that a large proportion of the labour losses that we've seen?
I mean, I think if you look at, we've lost at least 7% from people, not being trained up. You're going to say that that amount of people's retired. Then you're going to then look again at probably early retirement. So you can at least probably double that. So yeah, those are the issues, that you've got a lot of people, plus the people just leaving the industry for good just because they're fed up with aviation. Every 8 or 10 years is a boom bust cycle.
Okay, my question then is, what can be done to attract those people back into the sector?
The $1 million question. I mean, a lot of this is certainly at the lower end of the spectrum. It's the unskilled workers or semi-skilled workers, your customer service agents, your baggage handlers. They're low paid. They're paid at the minimum wage or around the minimum wage. And it's driven down by aviation runs on extremely tight margins. Maybe not at the moment. Some of the operators are making bumper profits, I'm quite sure. But there's been pressure always downwards, and it's a kind of pushing the cost savings all the way down. And so until the sector and the kind of the very bottom of the baggage handlers are paid more money, then there's very little we can do. So it's got to be attractive, paying a realistic wage, and in my opinion, looking at something similar to what happened for the HGV drivers, having a temporary relaxation of immigration rules for key aviation skills, whether that be for a short term or sort of the medium term. But there is little to do, and compounded by the fact is a lot of the HR people were made redundant in this period, and what they're being asked to do, it's not just the usual HR recruitment facility jobs they're doing. They've got unprecedented levels of recruitment to do with less staff to do it. So it is a nigh impossible task for an airline or an operator or people in the supply chain to pull off.
Yeah, thank you. I want to ask Jude, Karen, I'll come to you if I may, but I want to ask, this committee did an inquiry into automation and jobs that are mundane jobs being taken over by machines. So has there been a holdback and investment that mean to take workers away from jobs? For example, we're all very used now to putting our passports down on a machine that lets us through, whereas previously there was a whole army of people who were sitting around waiting for us to come through those gates. So are there other tasks within the airports that can be automated, or have we not invested in that because of the uncertainties that have been over the last few years?
Thank you. I think not having a clear view forward doesn't help with any investment, aviation or otherwise. There is certainly more that can be automated.
Can you give us some examples? What could be automated that currently isn't?
So if we look at pushback driving, for instance, we push an aircraft back, usually with a tug and 1 or 2 personnel. That can effectively be done with a robot now. Whether you're moving dollies of baggage around the airport or indeed air freight, again, some of that technology now exists where that can be done using AI or remotely. So there are those technologies that are out there. They're quite early days. There's a lot of security protocols, a lot of security regulations to get through. Bringing those in is complicated and testing it is expensive. I would say that there is one direction of travel on those things, and if we were to step forward 5, perhaps 10 years, I think that the airport and the number of people involved in a lot of those activities will look very different to now. It's just what pace of change that happens at, and perhaps what's happening this year will drive that forward at a faster pace.
It's a long-term fix rather than a short-term fix.
It's not going to save the summer.
Okay, Karen.
Thank you. Just wanted to come in on a couple of things. You asked about one of the barriers to recruitment, and I would, certainly from an airport's perspective, the lack of certainty about where the industry was going to go and when has been a huge barrier to our own recruitment. So many airports tried to start recruiting, in the autumn, November time, and actually then we just found that Omicron hit and we were shut down again. And so recruitment for our staffing levels has improved a lot since February and then since March, because that's when the restrictions were lifted and people could see a future. It's very difficult to recruit someone if they know then that actually there's not very much for them to do. So I just wanted to add that point. On automation, I mean, I think there are lots of things in the future that automation definitely will play a bigger part. One of the things I would point out at the moment, though, is although we have removed all of the restrictions here in the UK, there are still lots of destination countries that require additional checks. And so, the airlines in particular are having to do a lot more checking that they perhaps might not have had to do previously. And some of that, I believe, would mean that, you can't automatically just do a bag drop because you're having to show additional, documentation that actually requires them. It adds to their time, but it also means that it's more difficult and they need to check the requirements of the destination. It's not just a sort of blanket passport check that it might have been in the past.
Again, Oliver, do you share Danny's view that those who've left have gone to work in Amazon warehouses, training up to be heating engineers because there's a better future? How can we encourage more people back?
Pay them more. So it's as simple as that. I think there is a sense that people have seen a world outside of aviation and thought, actually, it's a decent world to be in compared with what I was doing, or compared with what is
because of the antisocial hours?
Well, there's always been antisocial hours. I mean, people are saying antisocial hours is a big issue, but we've always had them. If you're remunerated for antisocial hours, you think, well, okay, it's working shift work, it's not particularly social, but there's a cost benefit to it, and I think that's worth it because of the benefit I get from the wages. When wages drop and then people look outside of the industry and think, well, I can work in a supermarket and I'm indoors, I'm not outside on a wet, cold apron at 3 o'clock in the morning trying to find some bags that have gone missing, then they start thinking, well, actually, I'll work at a supermarket. So I think in some areas, because the pay is sufficiently low, there's a real sense of going somewhere else. In other parts, I think we talked about redundancy and the types of people who have left, very experienced operational people. So regardless of their skill set, very experienced operational people have left the industry. They were probably more likely to because severance packages better for people who served many years. They've left and they have no desire to come back. So
how can we create that desire to come back with that experienced workforce?
Well, I do think you need to look at the economics of the industry. You simply cannot keep the industry running with third-party providers effectively hoping for a schedule to come back and hoping that airlines will publish a schedule that will be stable. And that this year was very, very late because of the variants coming through. We've still got other end restrictions. So people were having to bet literally the future of their companies to say, at what point will we know there's a schedule where we as a company can invest knowing that that income will come in, which means we as a company will survive. So you've got to change the economics where they're not hoping on a stable schedule and investing to that. And if they get that wrong, it's a complete mess. But to say we've got to have a more stable contractual relationship, we've got to review the kind of ground handling regulations that came in through Europe and has an open market, an open season. And if you do that, then you will have a more stable economic environment, which will drive better terms and conditions. And we as a union will be happy to play our part in negotiating up those terms and conditions and getting decent terms and conditions for the industry, which is what it desperately needs at the moment to attract people.
Does that translate to higher fares?
I think ultimately, if you are going to sell a ticket for €20, that no way covers the cost of transporting that passenger. So inevitably, you're going to have to look at what is a sustainable fare. And I think that's something that is absolutely within the system. I know it's been looked at in Europe, it's been looked at elsewhere, is what is a sustainable fare?
So flights are just too cheap, is that really what you're saying?
Well, it's just too cheap, but it's also just too cheap for what the industry needs to do in terms of investment. And I'm not, there is a concern about technology and investment and whether we can do that. But most importantly, things like environmental issues. How can the industry address environmental issues and put the investment into alternative fuels if it's simply selling a ticket for €20 or £20? It just can't do that. So there isn't a sustainability economically for doing that.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Charlotte Nichols, please.
Thank you, Chair. And just as a declaration of interest, I'm a member of Unite the Union. Oliver, in your earlier answers, you made reference to things like fire and rehire that have taken place over recent years. And I suppose in terms of following some of the trends that we've seen within aviation, whether it's sort of BA moving over to sort of mixed fleet for airline staff, or the ways that things have been done in airports and airlines themselves. What do you think the sort of long-term impact of that is? Because I think we've been speaking today specifically about COVID, but it seems to me that these are much sort of longer reaching issues when it comes to sort of remuneration within aviation.
Yes, and I think previously aviation was seen as a career and a career destination. So people could say, I will get into the sector and I will remain in the sector. And we had a lot of people who served a long time there. Now, those people have enormous operational expertise. So if you have a ground handler, a loader of an aircraft who, as we've all been on a flight where a passenger hasn't turned up and the pilot says we're going to have to try and locate the bag within the hold of the passenger who hasn't turned up. An experienced ground handler can do that within 5-10 minutes. One who doesn't have that operational experience, they might have the skills, they might have been trained up, that's going to take them a longer period of time. So the operational expertise has begun to drain from the industry. You've got terms and conditions that's such that people are coming into the industry and saying, well, I'm in, but actually after a few months I don't like it. And we're seeing the increased turnover of new staff, where staff used to come in and think, I've made it, I'm here. We're now seeing a very high turnover of newly recruited staff. And the turnover for all organisations has gone up. So throughout the pandemic and afterwards it's gone up. And many organisations made redundancies to the level at which they thought that was going to be sufficient for the operation, only to find that people didn't return after furlough, didn't come back, or left voluntarily. So the industry simply is not attracting people into it, and long term I think that's going to cause problems for the ability for the industry to grow and to face some of the challenges that it's going to face in the future.
And in terms of the current staff shortages we're seeing, I suppose in many respects they are self-perpetuating, certainly where you have fewer staff who are overstretched, overworked, as Karen mentioned, having to do more checks when people are checking into flights, for example, longer queues, customers getting increasingly irate at the sort of waiting times and things like this. That's going to have an impact on the staff who are there. Are you seeing any health and safety impacts in terms of increased sickness absences or reports of stress from your members in aviation at the moment?
Well certainly I think I think probably Jude, etc., could answer some of the issues around what's being reported to companies. But in terms of the experience that staff are having, particularly customer-facing staff, is absolutely horrendous. So they face the abuse for the cancellation of the flight. They're having to deal with very upset and angry passengers. Quite often they have as little information as sometimes the passengers do. There's sometimes a distinction between the airline and the ground handler, so the person who's checking in or boarding a flight or providing information, and there's a breakdown in that. So there's a lot of frustration in the system, and unfortunately it's been taken out on people who are trying to make the system work as best as possible, but are obviously suffering from the kind of problems that we're facing. So a classic case of, for example, airport security. People are very concerned about flights taking off on time. They're turning up to airports very early. The whole operation is a just-in-time delivery system. So if you've got somebody turning up 3-4 hours early for a flight going through security with somebody turning up an hour before, it causes all sorts of stresses and strains. And that ultimately is the staff who have to deal with that and have to face that. So where the system goes out of kilter, it really does have an impact. And we are beginning to see that, the effect on our members. And again, it's pushing people away from the industry. So it's saying, I don't want to work here. I can go somewhere else where I don't face that kind of abuse.
Mr. Winstanley, did you want to come in on that?
Thank you. So a couple of points. We have recruited over 3,000 people since the start of the year, which was pretty much when we got certainty over the schedules and what the summer was looking like. It's been difficult. We agreed what I think was a generous pay package just before Christmas with both the G&B and Unite, and then we have topped that up over a number of sort of hard to recruit key locations, but we certainly had to work very, very hard to get here. We're now probably about 95% in terms of staffing, and next month we expect to be pretty much fully staffed. That leaves us with an organisation where probably around half of the staff are experienced and half of the staff are new. If you think it takes about 20 roles generally to turn and check in an aircraft, so you might find 10 old hands, 10 new hands. Staff welfare is incredibly important to us. Obviously, the vast majority of the time, operations work very, very well. Where we do get upset members of the public travelling, and let's face it, that's not just isolated to this summer. We clearly look after our people very well and take that very seriously. We haven't seen issues in relation to either safety or aircraft damage increase over this period, which is helpful. Our attrition is around 26%, which for the type of industry we're operating in does not trigger any alarm bells for us. And in terms of our sickness, our unplanned absence, which was about 10% in January, largely driven by some of the COVID overhang, has reduced month on month and is now just shy of about 5%. So a very challenging environment. It hasn't been easy to get here, but it feels as if we are closing the gap as to where we want to be.
And just in terms of my final question, and again to Mr. Richardson, is there anything that the government didn't do to prevent the current situation? I know that Unite were calling for financial support for businesses to be conditional on jobs guarantees, for example. Is that something that you think would have made a difference to the situation as it is at the moment?
A huge difference. So if you look at the USA and the CARES Act and their payroll support programs, which were conditional on no job losses and no payouts to shareholders, etc., they pretty much kept the infrastructure of aviation operating and running, and it has come out in a lot better position. If you look at Spain, with their ERTE scheme, which has only just finished in March, I think, this year. Again, that's conditional on no redundancies, and it was tiered in terms of the support, so it's scaled down as the industry scaled up. They've had much better transitions. So we had a stop-start position in terms of CJRS, and in particular, and I certainly remember the first extension in October 2020, and it was with Swissport. Literally, it came so late that several thousand people are being made redundant. So we'd negotiated an agreement to keep everybody in Swissport on the payroll, but effectively that first cut-off was at the point at which very significant redundancies were made. They couldn't be reversed because the change came at a very late period in time. And again, when we went into the second and final end of CJRS, it was exactly at the point at which further restrictions were beginning to be brought in, and we desperately needed to keep people within the system. Again, it could have been tailored support, it could have been conditional support, it could have been tiered so that when the industry came back, then the support would reduce. And that, as I said, is fundamental, because the economics of the industry are you've got to have the cash in the industry to fund everything. And if you don't have the cash in the industry, you can't fund, and you can't predict the cash being in the industry. There's nobody on the private markets that are going to say, I'll advance you the cash, I'll lend you the money, if in the hope that you're going to be right about the figures, when the whole of the industry, there's probably about a 10-15% variance in some of the predictions about what was going to come back this summer. So government support would have been absolutely critical in terms of the industry making it through the winter and being in the best position to deal with the very significant scale-up that we've experienced this summer.
Thank you. And in the final couple of minutes, Tony Antoniazzi, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair. I'll be brief. I was just listening, Jude, to you talking about the rebuilding of your recruitment, and I just was wondering how long, on average, does it take for a new recruit to get an airside pass? And, you know, is the vetting process getting any quicker? And is there anything that could be done to improve this process to get you where you need to be?
Thank you. So there are two types of airside passes. There's escorted passes, where you have to be funnily enough, escorted by somebody who has a full pass ID, and then there is the full pass ID. So from recruitment to being provided a escorted ID, probably about 2 weeks. And those 2 weeks would include induction training of probably sort of 45 hours, etc., and some initial checks through. To get a full airside pass takes around 60 to 90 days. It has a number of steps. One of the most arduous for us over this period has been the requirement for extensive referencing, because at the end of the day, you are at the behest of whoever you've asked for a reference. If they choose to delay providing one, that can really sort of string out the process. Obviously, we've had some changes recently in relation to HMRC checks. That's happened very recently. I think it's welcome. I think it's a bit early to say what sort of impact it will have, but I would expect it to be positive. And then you have the final sort of airport checks at the end of the process. So at the moment, around 20% of my workforce is on an escorted pass, and those continue to work through every day. We get more, etc. But as I'm now in a position where I'm broadly at my establishment headcount, that pass is really critical, as well as more sort of advanced skills. Those are the next big challenges for me.
Okay. Karen, would you like to?
I mean, similar figures for us because it's all about the same vetting process. I think the one thing I would add is that the system is speeding up a little bit, but there certainly were delays, and it took much longer when recruitment really kicked in. So we do, as airports, there are still, I would say, several hundreds of people who are still awaiting that final clearance. And those are dedicated people that have had job offers. And one of the things that is a barrier that we're having to face is that for some people, they don't want to wait that long. And they can go in a tight labour market, they can find work elsewhere. And so, we are also finding some churn there. But we're feeling much more confident now that the system seems to have speeded up. The government has brought in 1 or 2 alleviations. They've put a bit more resource into the checks, and that is helping. But still, it takes 3 months.
Could anything else be done?
I think that some of those alleviations are due to come to an end, and I think it's very clear that our recruitment processes are going to, because of the very welcome rebound we've seen, we will probably carry on recruiting for some time. We'd like to see those extended. There's probably more that I think industry would like government to be able to do in terms of helping with HMRC, because as you say, it's quite a long, particularly during COVID when people have had many, many different types of work. Getting those references, which we do need, it's a secure environment, it's quite a challenge. So, any more that we can do with government to streamline that process, I think would be really welcome, not just to airports, but I think other partners on the site.
I agree. I employ dozens of people just to chase through those passes. 11 in Manchester alone, 5 or 6 in Birmingham, and that is all they do all day, just to get those passes through because it's so critical for us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very quickly, yes or no, will this be fixed in time for the summer? Oliver Richardson.
Unless we work together, no.
Jude Winstanley.
I would agree with Oliver.
R&D.
I hope it will be better, but not totally.
These are not yes or no's, but I think they're all no's. Danny Brooks.
No.
No. Thank you for that.
Yeah. Karen, could you respond in writing with a bit more detail about those adjustments that you say are coming to an end, alleviations, and I thought the HMRC issue was sorted so that HMRC data, previous employer data, can be found, but you implied that they could do more, so maybe you could follow that a bit further, because there seem, and am I right, it's the CAA that is the organisation that is granting the security passes?
Not always. Sometimes
Not always.
there are other parties,
parties.
via Cabinet Office involved.
Okay, thank you.
If you could write to us
We
about
can
that,
we'll write.
that'd be
Some more
very
detail would be useful. Thank
Thank you so much. And forgive me, I should have declared at the beginning that I'm a member of Unite the Union. Sorry.
Oh, sorry, and I should have declared that I know Oliver as a constituent, and I also know Simon Calder as well, socially.
Very good. Okay, thank you to all 4 of you. Moving on to panel 3.
Party member in this room.
Which let the nameplates change over.
I'll give each member a copy of that for me.
So if we could welcome please David Burling, who's the CEO for Markets and Airlines from TUI, Sophie Deckers, the Chief Commercial Officer from EasyJet, just in the middle there, and then Lisa Tremble, the Chief Corporate Affairs Director from British Airways. This is our CEO panel. Just for the public record, obviously, this morning, CEO of EasyJet is unwell, and so we're delighted to welcome Sophie Deckers in his place. And the CEO of British Airways unfortunately couldn't find the time to be with us this morning, but through correspondence last night, he's going to come and see us in a couple of weeks. So we're delighted to welcome Lisa Tremble, and we'll invite the CEO of EasyJet to come at this later opportunity alongside the CEO of British Airways in a couple of weeks as well. Lisa Tremble, can I come to you first, please? We've been hearing about the labour shortage issues, and that British Airways has by far had the most cancellations per day of any airline at the moment. You sacked 10,000 workers aggressively using the fire and rehire tactic. Isn't it your own fault?
Look, I think that, you've heard a lot from the panel today about the complicated process that all airlines have been through over the last 2 years. So if I take a step back and look at the context in which those decisions were taken by the management committee at the time, British Airways was basically losing £20 million a day. The schedule around that time was 5% of 2019 levels. There wasn't a vaccine in sight, and there wasn't certainty over the furlough programme being extended. And actually, the furlough scheme itself only covered 10% of the 2019 employee bill that we had to pay. So look, the airline itself was in a very precarious situation, and the actions taken were to secure the future of the airline and save as many jobs as possible. So that was the context in which those decisions were taken.
We heard that Ryanair negotiated an agreement with the unions not to sack anybody, and that they're absolutely fine at the moment, bar the odd flight cancellation. British Airways sacked the most people, 10,000, again, using aggressive fire and rehire tactics, and you're having the worst time. Are you saying there's not a connection between the two?
Look, I'm not saying there's not a connection. What I'm saying to you is it was a very, very difficult period.
You regret sacking so many of your staff?
So it was a very difficult period for the airline to go through. And look, when you're looking in the face of £20 million a day losses, no end to restrictions in sight, no certainty over the future of the furlough scheme, and at the time, obviously, no kind of indication as to when there would be a vaccine.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Lisa, but it's the same answer as before. So I understand the position. What I'm trying to understand is why different airlines are having a better time than others. And we've been told that it's predominantly about labour shortages. And I just want to understand whether you, as the representative of British Airways, think you're having the worst experience because you sacked the most staff using very aggressive tactics. Do you think that is true or not?
So I think the company behaved in the most responsible way possible with the information it had in this financial situation.
Do you think there was a connection
at the time
between sacking 10,000 staff and now cancelling 114 flights a day?
So we're now trying to recruit about 6,000 people.
Do you answer my question, Lisa? Do you think there was a connection between sacking 10,000 members of your staff, using aggressive fire and rehire tactics, and now cancelling the most flights per day? Was there a connection between those two events, yes or no?
So look, it's very complicated, isn't it? Because, we right-sized the business at the time. If the pandemic had come to an end quicker than what we expected, then perhaps the situation would have been different. But faced with the decisions, faced with the financial losses, the company had to protect as many jobs as possible.
You don't think there was a connection? You think it was all due to COVID? There's not a connection between sacking 10,000 staff and now not having enough staff to fly all your planes?
I think that basically when you're facing into being a loss-making company with no end to anything in sight, you do have to take some decisions on the basis of securing as many jobs as possible in the future of the company.
Why?
You can try.
Yeah. Ryanair faced exactly the same challenges as BA. So why did Ryanair not suffer the same problems of cancellations as BA has done? Why is BA's challenge any different from Ryanair's?
I think we've all had very similar challenges, and as everyone's pointed out, different approaches were taken by different companies at the time, depending on you know, the financial viability of running the operation. You know, at BA we have 268 aeroplanes. We fly to 65 different countries. We have a very extensive network, and basically in 2020 we were flying 5% of our schedule. We basically did access the furlough scheme, and that covered 10%, just 10% of our 2019 employee bill. So look, I think we were in a very difficult situation at that time, and I think that the decisions were taken in order to protect as many jobs as possible. What we've seen is that during the last 2 years, the pandemic has continued. We've seen, you know, aviation was the first to go in and the last to come out. If it's okay, I'd like to just touch on the question about
I'm afraid we don't have
cancellations.
time, Lisa. I'm sorry. We've only got about 45 minutes. We've asked you a very direct question, I think 3 times, and you've chosen not to answer it. I'm going to give you one last opportunity. Do you think sacking 10,000 staff has had a direct consequence for you having labour shortages and not being able to fly your planes today?
I think that the company took a responsible
Okay, so you're not willing to answer the question. If I could move on to EasyJet, please, Sophie Deckers. I understand that you also made about 5,000 staff redundant, and in the league table given to us by Simon Calder this morning, EasyJet was the second worst airline with around 55 flights being cancelled per day. Do you think there was a connection between the number of staff you sacked and your ability to fly planes today?
I'd like to start with a correction as well as welcoming the opportunity to talk to you today. So thank you for that, and also an apology because we haven't got it right and we need to get it right. I'd like to have that on the record. In terms of the correction, we made around 2,000 staff redundant. Of those, 1,400 were UK staff and the rest were in Europe. Of those, around 20% were management and admin staff. We didn't make any pilots redundant. It was cabin crew of the 1,100, that's the net number in the UK. And we do have a ramp down in the winter anyway, and we do, even pre-pandemic, we would operate on a seasonal basis, so we would be recruiting for the summer anyway. So yes, I would say that number of crew is higher than it would be in the normal circumstances, but that is quite normal. So so we're talking about 1,100 crew. We're talking about 300 office staff that we had to that were voluntary redundancies. Actually, we didn't have to do any forced redundancies. Everyone we're bringing back on the contracts they were on previously. In terms of the pilots, what we did is we offered them part-time contracts. Rather than redundancy. Interestingly, now we've offered all those pilots to come back full-time, but we've given them the option, and around 75% have said they want to come back full-time. 25% said, actually, we quite like this new lifestyle, we would like to stay part-time, which for us works in terms of seasonality of the amount of flying in the summer and the winter. So I think the key challenge, to answer your question, is around the recruitment process and the ID checking, which has already been touched on this morning. So we started ramping up the recruitment for this summer. What has taken longer is the ID processing. The key part of that is it's taking around 14 weeks now to get crew ID passes. It was around 10 weeks pre-pandemic in a normal year. The complexity is you need the last 5 years worth of referencing, and as we know, lots of people, we again touched on this morning, have taken other roles, but multiple roles, and it's up to the way that we have to work at the moment is through the individual who we're recruiting. We have to get them to get all of those references, and in many cases people have had 10 jobs in the last couple of years, so you know, and maybe some of them were only for a couple of weeks, but we're required to get a reference from each of those. So that's what's taking the length of time. We have today, this morning's numbers, 142 crew ready trained to go online that don't have their ID passes. So we had planned for this summer, we'd planned for the ramp up. The ID processing, I think, has caught us by surprise and has taken longer than we had ever planned or anticipated. And if we look at historical timings, is out of kilter of where we've been historically. So that's one of the compounding factors that we've got that's facing us today.
Thank you. And David Burling, from a TUI perspective, clearly the job of an airline is to match a customer with a seat and to fly them to their destination on the day they want to be flown to that destination. Why, I think TUI's been coming in as an airline having difficulties, not on the same scale as British Airways and EasyJet, but is it the same problems for you or is it another problem?
I think we are different from the other airlines mentioned because we had a real concentrated problem in the first week of the May half-term holiday. We're also actually different because, as you say, we're a holiday company. We have 67 aircraft in the UK. We don't do overbookings. We always bring customers back from the destination. So the stories you hear about people being stranded without flights and hotels does not apply to TUI. And we also very rarely cancel outbound flights. So we've actually been whole years without cancelling an outbound flight for operational reasons. So this is almost a unique situation for TUI. We've never cancelled a flight for baggage handling issues before. But as we went through May, it was very clear, even though our capacity was the same as what we operated in 2019, it was very clear that a number of different things in the overall ecosystem, whether that's security queues, loading bags on planes, delivering food and drink or even fuel to the aircraft, these were all not operating as well as would be in a normal year. And all that brought stress into the system. As we went into the first weekend of the bank holiday, we then faced a real severe weather problem in one of our destinations in Crete. So a lot of aircraft got stranded. And then when we then went to look for alternative aircraft in the third-party market, we found it was the Champions League final, and most aircraft in Europe, spare aircraft, were being used for that. So on top of that, that weekend we had very high load factors. Our flights were almost completely full. And I think those combination of things caused the system to melt down. And it struggled really in one particular area, the worst point, which was in the baggage loading, particularly in Manchester Airport, which is where Swissport, our provider, struggled to cope. I think after that, we had to cancel 32 flights at the last minute. The service we offered to customers was unacceptable by our standards. We're incredibly sorry and apologise for that. We went, as Simon said earlier, we went straight out texting customers with what compensation they were entitled to, and we went over and above what we offered customers, in some cases up to £400 per person extra in terms of vouchers. But we know that doesn't make up for a lost holiday. So I think the very next day, our emphasis was making sure this doesn't repeat. So we realised Manchester was the problem with the baggage issue in particular, and we created a fire break in our programme by cancelling 43 flights a week in Manchester through June to make sure that the system could stabilise again and we could cope. We've also realised that we need to take other measures in order to build more resilience into the system where we had more control. So we've contracted extra aircraft and extra cabin crew, which gives us more resilience. We've got extra spares in the business, so if there's a technical issue, we can correct them quicker. We've got extra customer service people, both in our head office, but in particular in the airports, because that weekend we did not have enough customer service people in the airports. But as Sophie said, those customer service people we're now getting in the airports are currently in the security clearance system. And we also have, we didn't make any pilots or cabin crew redundant during the pandemic, but we still had to recruit 1,400 cabin crew, and some of those are still in the security clearance process, and that will be solved by the end of this month, but we're still in that process now.
Okay, thank you. Tony Antoniezzi, please.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Are the staff that have left the industry during the pandemic seeking re-employment? I mean, you said you didn't leave any staff go. Sophie, you didn't have very many. I'd ask that question to Lisa.
Yeah, so what we did during the process of consultation with our unions was make sure that we created a pool of people who could come back to the business when it recovered. So when we went out to recruit at the beginning of October last year, we went first to the group of people who had already worked for British Airways to invite them to come back, and I'm pleased to say that some of those people did. I think, everyone's touched on this issue. There is kind of a wider issue in attraction into the industry, not least because it's been very uncertain over the last couple of years. And I think people have kind of realised that, the travel industry is going to take some time to recover. There's absolutely no doubt about that. We're in that period now where we need to rebuild. So I think I do feel optimistic about the future, because to date we've had 42,000 applicants to work at British Airways. We've had 2,000 people now operational in the business, and we have 3,000 people in the referencing process, which my colleagues have touched upon. And we're working through those numbers as quickly as we can. It's taking us between 70 and 140 days to get people through that process, hence the delays. So yes, some people have come back into the industry, but there's some areas of the business, for example, below wing and baggage handling, where I think everyone is experiencing it's a much more difficult market to attract people into.
And how are you going to make your employment practices at British Airways better then? Why would I want to come and work for you?
Yeah, look, it's a great question, because I think, there's been a lot written about fire and rehire, and obviously the chairman asked me questions about that at the beginning. Look, we completely want our people to feel like they're part of rebuilding this airline, and we completely accept that, what's happened over the last 2 years has put us in a position where we need to build that relationship of trust with our unions and with our people. But we are absolutely determined to do that. So one example of this is this year we offered our people a 10% pay award. 5% was paid in March, with a further 3 and 2% September and December. 90% of our people accepted that pay award, and we've committed to having constructive talks with the unions and our people about the pay deal for 2023. And look, when you've been through a very traumatic period like we have, and that's for our people and for our customers, it takes time to rebuild the trust and those relationships. But that does get us out of bed every day. That's what we want to do, and that's what we're determined to do, but it will take some time to do that.
And is there a dynamism in British Airways that you want to drive this forward, that you want to be better?
Yeah, absolutely. So we definitely want to be better. No one wants to let customers down, least of not us. We want to provide the best possible service, and we want to be the best of British. So we're all absolutely galvanised behind making everything at British Airways better. And to be frank, we know we've got a lot of work to do, but our people need to be right at the centre of the recovery of this business. And we accept that, in the past, mistrust has built up, and we need to fix that moving forwards and have a better dialogue with them.
Okay, so the security clearances, that needs to be quicker, that needs to be addressed, and just saying that there are enough pilots out there. Are there enough trained pilots out there for the need?
So on the pilot front, we aren't experiencing issues on the pilot front. It's mainly getting people through the cabin crew, and below wing in particular is a difficult market to recruit into. But I go back to the point that what does give me absolute optimism is the number of people that have applied to rejoin the aviation sector. So that is some positive news to take out.
And what problems are you anticipating in the next few months?
Yeah, so look, our strategy, which I think Simon touched on earlier, so by early May we'd looked ahead throughout the summer. We took the proactive decision to take 10% of our schedule out. So to put that into context, that's about 16,500 flights, and that works out around 80 per day. We took that decision because we were able to re-accommodate 80 to 85% of our passengers. So by looking ahead and matching the resource to the schedule, taking into account all of the other supply chain issues that we were having as well, that we were able to kind of look ahead and take that capacity out. Because, you know, the last thing that we want to do is let a customer down on the day. That's the worst situation for us to be in. So I know that the committee was particularly interested in May half term, which is just gone. So we flew between the 28th of May and the 5th of June, just under 6,000 flights, and we took 23 on the day cancellations. Those were because of weather, air traffic control, and we did experience high levels of staff sickness. And obviously, you know, our huge apology to those customers that were impacted by that. It's not where we want to be, and we want to make sure that we make our schedule as resilient as possible moving forwards.
Okay, thank you very much. Mark Pawsey, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman, we've got three airlines in front of us who have told us about having to cancel lots of flights and how desperately sorry they are for all of the travellers who've been affected by that. But we heard in our very first session from Sue Davies and Simon Calder that the airlines have made information about compensation packages deliberately obscure, and they've gone out of their way not to make it easy for passengers to get the compensation to which they're entitled. Sophie Deckers, is that a fair charge?
I think, and I'm more than happy to share the customer communications that goes to our customers with the committee so you can see it yourselves.
So Simon Calder and Sue Davies are telling us, giving us an inaccurate picture?
I think where we are today is much better than we were at the very beginning.
Are they giving us an inaccurate picture?
I would argue that yes, they are.
David, are they giving us an inaccurate picture?
I think you heard Simon talk about TUI, that TUI in particular was very clear in its process.
Okay. And Lisa, were they giving us an inaccurate picture?
So I think that we've improved the communication, as Sophie said, over the last 6 to 9 months to make sure that customers know what they're entitled to.
Chairman, we've got three airlines here who are paragons of virtue, and it's all the other guys who are the bad guys. Is that what you're telling us?
No, definitely. I can't speak on everyone's...
What are you going to do to make it easier for British Airways customers to get the compensation to which they're entitled? What positive steps, Lisa, can you tell us about right now?
Yeah, so basically we'll send the customer communications to you when we flag that in our customer
You've got big, long, complicated terms and conditions. Simon was very critical of your terms. Are you amending your terms and conditions?
We've basically changed our customer communications.
Are you changing your terms and conditions?
So the terms and conditions are about what people are entitled to, and I can tell you that the customer comms makes it clear that people are entitled to EU 261 compensation. We have a page on our website which is very clear about how people apply for that.
So you're saying it's a doddle. So if I have a cancelled flight, I can go straight to your website and very easily find out exactly what I'm entitled to, and it's a really easy process. Is that what you're saying?
For the majority of people, it should be a seamless
How quickly
process.
would I get my compensation from BA?
So basically, for a refund of your flight, which is that should be done within 7 days, and the EU 261 compensation, we're aiming to do that within 14 days. Sometimes it does take slightly longer.
No extension. It's never going to be more than a few days, and then 14 days for people to get their compensation.
What I would say, for the majority of straightforward bookings, it can happen very quickly and it's straightforward. For some of the more complicated bookings where there's multi-legs or people have used Avios points, it takes us about 30 days to do that.
What's your time, Sophie?
Yep, so our current time, the customers receive the email, which again I'm happy to share with the committee. It says you're entitled to rebook your flight. Here's a link to do that. You're entitled to a refund. Here's the 3 clicks it takes to get your refund. You're entitled to a voucher if you prefer. And then here is your rights for additional compensation. So we're very explicit about what we can do. I would admit at the very beginning we maybe weren't as explicit as we are now. In terms of processing times, as of today, we are processing refunds between 1 and 4 days. We are processing compensation, EU 261 compensation within 7 days, and expenses within 9 days. Expenses are slightly longer, so you've got receipts and so on to go through, but the maximum for any of those processes is 9 days for expenses, 7 days for EU 261, and up to 4 days, on average between 1 and 4 days for refunds. So we've extended our contact centre times from what was 8 to 8 to be 7 till 11, so that we can make sure that customers get their money as quickly as possible.
David, you told us that in your evidence that you were giving an extra £400 in vouchers to people who'd gone through this disaster at Manchester. Are you the good guys here?
I think, as Simon said earlier, we're very clear in our communication. We send text messages out to people, making it very clear what they're entitled to in terms of the refund, the EU 261. We provide a link to the EU 261, and we've been given compensation over and above.
Right. Well, thank you for that. And Chairman, I think we've put out a call for evidence to the general public, so it'll be very interesting to compare what the public are telling us with the evidence that our three witnesses have just given us.
And there was one other point that's about being booked onto the best available flight. Do all of you do that? And even if that flight is operated by a different carrier with which you don't have a commercial relationship with? David first.
Ours is slightly different because we're a package holiday, so we offer people an alternative flight or an alternative holiday, so quite often they will change destination.
They want to take the holiday, the hotel at the destination, and you've not got a flight, but another carrier has got a flight to that destination. Will you provide that to the passengers?
We provide an alternative flight on TUI, or we will offer a full refund. So we have a range of options which give customers complete flexibility.
That family can't take their holiday, say on an island in Greece, even if they're with your hotel, but you're not prepared to put them on like an EasyJet flight or whatever.
The contract is a package holiday, so we effectively cancel the package holiday and then effectively start again in recreating it.
Yeah, so we offer people the opportunity to rebook with us immediately, and I think that's better than offering an immediate refund. If you imagine the original price they might have paid us £50 to rebook for a flight tomorrow would cost more than that. So
it depends on the reason for their flying and whether cost is more important, or whether
we offer them the refund option anyway, so they've got the choice to refund.
They have to book the alternative flight themselves.
We will rebook them if it's an EasyJet flight because we have the systems and ability to do that. We are, through that link in the email, which it does link through and say you are able to rebook with another carrier, and we will refund that. And that's very explicit in the terms that we have that links through to that. We don't have the booking systems to book through with other airlines. We all sit on different booking systems. We will absolutely honour our duties to refund customers.
Even if they're returning back even if they're on holiday and returning home?
Yeah, it's regardless of whether they're on outbound or return. We treat every customer on a single leg journey as a single leg journey, so yeah.
And Lisa?
It's a similar situation. So we offer an immediate refund. We offer to rebook within appropriate timescales. So, for example, 80 to 85% of our cancellations could fly within 24 hours, either on our aeroplane or a different carrier. And we also offer vouchers.
Is that all carriers or only carriers with which you have a business relationship with?
So we endeavour to we endeavour to get people on a flight. We are part of international airlines groups, so we do have access to other carriers as well. I think one of the issues that everyone is finding is that the loads are really high on all of the flights that are running at the moment, so it's sometimes not quite as straightforward as it was being able to ask EasyJet to take on our customers because the passenger loads are very high.
So I'm clear. Ruth Cadbury asked you if you rebook your customers onto flights from non-IAG airlines,
yes,
for example, EasyJet, but you do that?
You do.
Okay, thank you. Paul Howell, please.
Yep, thank you, Chair. Yeah, I just want to go back to the discussion around the problems that you've had and try to understand a little bit how much you guys are victims and how much is your own fault, if you like. You know, that if the problems are in the handling system, how much is that affecting you, or if it's a problem because you haven't got your staff to do things. So I just want to try and understand, the relative impact of those two sides? If let's start with you, David, and let's go left to right.
Yes, I mean, I think, as I said, for the airline industry to work, multiple things in this ecosystem needs to work. We have more control over some of those items, like cabin crew and pilots. Then we have outsourced partners, and then there's other things like air traffic control, strikes or things that we have less control on. I think we are in a situation this year where a number of those things aren't working well, and they tend to multiply together. So when one of them doesn't work, it multiplies with another, and then you end up with aircraft in the wrong place, the crew are in the wrong place. So I think we are victims of that, and I also run in my role, only 30% of my role is overseeing the UK. I also look after airlines in Europe. And in Europe, as Simon quite rightly said, Amsterdam is a real problem in terms of security. But most of the aviation sector in Europe has a security issue, but not a lot of the other issues we have. So with baggage handling and with other things. And I think it does come back to what lots of people have said about the shutdown in the industry was more dramatic than in other countries in Europe. Which to some extent is surprising considering we were the first with the vaccine, but it was more dramatic. The furlough scheme in the UK ended in September. In a lot of Europe, the equivalent schemes carried on till March, April, or even now. We obviously had Brexit. So there's a lot of those challenges, and obviously we've talked a lot about the security clearance. So I think there are a lot of things, but ultimately, customers pay their money to us. You know, we are accountable for that ecosystem, and therefore it's our responsibility to try and put that right. And as I say at TUI, after our really difficult weekend, we wanted to put more resilience into the things we could control. So more spare aircraft, more spare cabin crew, and in particular, what we can do to help Swissport, which is probably our biggest challenge in terms of their issues. And I'm meeting every week with a global CEO of Swissport, looking at what we can do to improve that. And it is getting better. I think what people said about the security clearance issues, it is getting better. So I don't think there's a simple answer. There's lots of parts of it. We're one part of it, but there are more challenges than in a normal year.
Yeah, but if for anybody that's running a business, there's things that's in your gift, and you need to control those as much as you can. And sometimes, you will be a victim of something else. You've obviously got to have a view over the horizon. And just want to pick up on just slightly. I mean, I've had one flight in recent times, which happened to be a trip from Leeds Bradford Airport to Malaga. Security going out was an absolute nightmare. Security coming back was seamless. There was no problems at Malaga in terms of coming into that. So I dispute your security comment there in terms of everything else just seemed to work. It was just the security at Leeds was my specific experience there. But I just want to go along the table first in terms of understanding how much you were planning correctly and managing your business and being not aware enough or not getting the right feedback or things from others as to where it is. I just want to understand where the problem is, whether it's your control or somebody else's.
And I think, just to build on exactly what David said, and you've heard already this morning, it is there are multiple factors. There are things that are within our control, which is around crew, and we've already talked about some of the challenges of ID processing and not getting them back online as quickly as we would have planned and anticipated to. We hold our hands up absolutely 100%
Just to interrupt you just 1 second there, just in terms of the security clearance process there. You've talked about the things that you need to go through because of multiple references and everything. Is that something that's your policy, or is that an industry standard that you have to meet in terms of that?
It's an industry standard. It's an industry standard, and it's compounded, as I say, by the fact that multiple people have had multiple roles. I think our ask would be that we could have, and we have asked for this, for government supporters having direct access to HMRC database. That means you're not then asking the individual to then go and ask their previous employees. We can much more quickly do that process. So that would be a fix to that issue, and that would be something that could happen now that would actually really, you know, I've talked about the 142 crew that are sitting there trained, ready to fly. That would help resolve some of those issues. What we have done is we have now brought in-house 55 additional people from other roles within the business that have just focused on helping to chase up the phone calls to try and get those referencing. So I think that's critical. I think you're absolutely right, and we've heard this morning in terms of ground handling, that's another pinch point, and also air traffic control. So if you add all those things together, it just takes one of those to get out of kilter to have a knock-on impact. So, you know, this morning we have, and it's not massive delays, but you have Eurocontrol, you've got other air traffic jurisdictions that are each got between 20 and 35 minutes delays. Now, any delay that happens in terms of air traffic then has a knock-on impact in terms of the time the planes are coming in and then the ground handling resource to handle that. Because
just apologies for interrupting you, but just in terms of like your air traffic thing, we've all flown many times over many years, and you always get comments about air traffic. Is air traffic problems better or worse than what we would have seen pre-pandemic?
What we're seeing at the moment in the near term is higher levels of sickness, which we're seeing across the industry in every single part of the industry. So we're seeing higher levels of sickness. So if you take one air traffic controller out, that reduces the flow rate of what the airport can handle quite significantly. Now, you know, we understand we have very open dialogues with the air traffic controllers. We understand that for the UK, if we look at sort of Gatwick for specifically, this summer they will have more air traffic controllers than they had in 19, but at the moment it's still in that ramp-up period. So every single layer of the industry is going through this ramp up, this ID processing, the same challenges, so it doesn't take much for one of those elements. And I'm not here to point the finger at outside of EasyJet. It's our fault as much as it is where we are with ground handling, where we are with ATC. It's the ecosystem we're in at the moment that is causing the issues, and it takes one of those to knock the others out of kilter and have a much bigger impact on the operation. Okay,
and obviously the end result is an impact on customers. And that's the people that matter at the end of the day. And you as a business have to look very close now. I think it's EasyJet that's been quoted as having people actually taking off a plane that was ready to depart in terms of your planning. You know, where it's got so late in terms of the decision not to fly that the people have actually been on the plane ready to go. How can you get to that sort of situation? I mean, surely your planning would know well before then that plane can't leave.
No, absolutely, and those circumstances are horrible. We would not want those at all. You know, I put myself in every single passenger's shoes, and I fly, and I have 2 young children, so I would not want to be one of any of the families that I'm sure you've heard from your own constituencies either. So the issue is then what we have is the things like the knock-on delays of air traffic control, things like the knock-on delays of ground handling, then mean we get to the point where the crew are then out of hours, and then they're not able to operate, which then means the next day they're not able to operate either the return sector and so on.
From a crew point of view, when you're loading the plane, you must know whether the crew are capable of flying it from their hours.
Yeah, so when the crew get on board and we're ready to depart, and I'm sure maybe you've been on flights similar, they say we're just waiting for an air traffic control slot. And you don't know how long you're waiting for that air traffic control slot. And they might say, well, actually, no, we're now going to have to wait another hour. And it's those unforeseen circumstances that mean we end up having those knock-on impacts. So we absolutely do not want to be cancelling people on the day or offloading passengers. That's the worst. I think if you get on the plane, you think, right, I'm here, I'm going on my holiday now. The worst thing is to then have to offload anybody. But the knock-on impact is that infrastructure we've got at the moment, and the fact that there are knock-on delays that are having impact then on crew and our ability to serve customers.
I have to say, I find it remarkable that there's spare capacity in the flight for the pilots or whatever to take off is so tight that an hour's delay on the runway or the holding pattern is enough to stop the plane. I find that.
Now, what would happen is that the plane would take off an hour late, it would get to Palma de Mallorca, and then in Palma de Mallorca it would miss its slot in Palma de Mallorca, and therefore it would then become even later coming back to the UK, and then it would just keep picking up ongoing delays. Or it might be late loading bags at Manchester, it's 2 hours late, it can't get to a Greek island because the Greek island's airport is closed, or the number of hours that the cabin crew can work has expired, and therefore the aircraft gets stuck in a Greek island, and therefore we don't have an aircraft for the next day. Which is why I said earlier, we as an industry, and this is what TUI's doing, is building more resilience in what we can control. So in a normal year we would have 2 spare aircraft. We've now contracted extra, so we've got 5 spare aircraft and extra crew, so that we can cope with more bumps in the system than you would have in a normal.
I get that. I need to move along a little bit, but I still find it remarkable that there was so little resilience left in the system in terms of where you've been. I applaud the fact that you're moving for more resilience, but it feels to me like you should have had it in the first place. Sorry, Lisa, just to give you the opportunity to go back.
Yeah, look, I would just echo what my colleagues have said. You know, basically, we all have a responsibility for the problems that are currently in the system, and I think what's really important is that we talk about what we can do to fix it, because customers don't really care whose fault it is. They want us to work together and fix things moving forward.
But do you, sorry, just to, well, we need to move along a little bit, but so do you agree that, with my last comment a few seconds ago, in terms of you probably didn't have enough resilience in your system going into the problems that were there?
I think, look, we've built in the resilience as we've moved forward. So we've done that in April, we've done that in May, and we're keeping everything under review. So, yes, we're building in resilience as we go through the season. And as resources come in and some of the issues we've talked about get resolved, things will get easier.
But it doesn't feel to me as though you had as much as you would need for the planning and commitment you were making to your customer base.
Because the key thing is resource, and we didn't have it. Thanks.
Just very, very briefly, we heard earlier that whilst BA's got the highest number of cancellations, passengers tend to be told with more notice, but that EasyJet seems to have a higher proportion of cancellations being informed at the airport. Why is that?
So I don't know the relative cancellation at the airport numbers. I can talk about the cancellations. Let me talk about yesterday, for example. We operated 1,682 flights. 10 were cancelled on the day. 2 of those were due to crew, and a number of those is because they were out of hours from the previous day. 2 were due to air traffic control, and 6 were due to tech. So these are the normal sorts of factors you would see. I think the crew factor is probably one that is and that has been a challenge for us, which is why we've taken actions like we've reduced the capacity on our A319s, which you may have heard about, which means we have 1 more crew member to go into our standby pool. So that's what we're trying to do in terms. That was an immediate action we could take when we knew we weren't going to get enough through ID processing in the time we needed.
Oh, but do you disagree with what we heard earlier, that EasyJet has more cancellations at the airport than other airlines? Do you disagree with that?
I don't know the relative numbers,
you don't know.
But I do know that we have been taking preemptive cancellations. Has been the key thing we've been doing, and then there have been some on the day that we want to move away from. We don't want on the day cancellations.
And so there's no particular reason you can explain to us as to why EasyJet might have a higher number of cancellations being informed to customers at the airport as opposed to before they've got there? Not
that I can talk relative to my peers, no.
Okay, I mean, we did a survey for the public, and it was 60% of customers were told at the airport. 70% of them weren't given a reason, and the vast majority of the respondents were EasyJet customers. I think it was Simon Calder that said earlier that there were more cancellations at the airport. But
so we operated 96% of our capacity during the May half term. So we made about 3.5% on the day cancellations. Now that's too much. But that's the numbers. We are the biggest operator at the moment, so proportionally
let me just give you a very anecdotal example, and I've not asked whether this is okay, but my mum was due to go to Italy last Saturday from Bristol Airport. I drove her to the airport in the morning. She got there a couple of hours early. She went through security, had her bag in, went to the checkout queue, saw the bags being put on the EasyJet flight, told there was a delay, queued in the queue for, I think it was an hour or something, and then told that the flight was cancelled, and then had to wait a couple of hours to get her bags. Why would you not have known in advance that you couldn't fly that plane to Italy?
So, where possible, we absolutely would cancel in advance, and I'm really sorry for that specific example that obviously impacted...
It's affecting lots of people. That's the evidence we're getting. What I'm trying to understand is what are the reasons why BA might be able to tell us in advance that the flight's going to be cancelled, but EasyJet seemingly...
The majority of cancellations we are doing are in advance. So if you look at the total number of cancellations, the majority are being made in advance.
How far in advance? Sorry, Jeff.
So it varies. So we had made some cancellations for July and August back in May and April. In those instances, picking up on Lisa's points, we are able to offer 91% of people, we could offer them another flight on the same day with we have 6 flights a day from Gatwick to Malaga, for example. So we would much rather do that because passengers have an alternative option. So that's absolutely what we're doing. I think the pieces that are causing more on the day cancellations is the run rate that we're seeing and the lag effect of things like getting ID passes cleared. So that's unforeseen. and the process that is taking us longer, which is why we've thrown a lot of resource at it. And as I say, we have capped now the number of passengers on the flight so that we can release crew to be able to be in the standby pool. So we're trying to take some clear action to avoid that. It's not, an on-the-day cancellation isn't good enough, and I completely agree with
I'm sure we all agree. We'll write to all of the airlines, you and others, and ask for the data about cancellations and notice periods for customers. Alex Stafford, please.
Thank you, Chairman. When you overbook flights, what criteria do you have to taking people off the flights? How do you choose who gets to fly and who doesn't get to fly?
So at the moment, overbooking isn't the issue that we're experiencing, but as Simon referenced earlier, it was something that happened more frequently in 2019, and there was reasons for that to happen.
Yeah, but it's still happening, so what's the criteria?
So as Simon referenced, you talk to customers and look for volunteers, and then you compensate them.
So a BA does not have a policy at all of seeing whether it's people who book directly through BA or through a third-party agency?
No, we basically do it on the day on the flight.
Is that same with EasyJet?
Yeah, I mean, the majority of bookings are direct with EasyJet anyway, but it is we ask for volunteers, and normally you do get more volunteers than actually than you need.
Yeah. And so we don't overbook. Now, on cancellations overbooking, do you have the statistics of how many people book directly with BA or EasyJet or TUI or through a third party, and when they do, and who gets bumped off flights and who gets their flights cancelled? Is that information that provided to the committee of seeing whether flights are mainly booked through travel agents are more likely to be cancelled than those who aren't?
So I'll write to the committee with that information afterwards, but I think on the day, we don't judge who booked the flight. It's basically the flights are cancelled either on the day for a set of circumstances, or as we've done is basically plan in advance to basically take out the capacity to make the operation more resilient. So it isn't about who booked the flight and where. On a BA flight, you'd have a mix of people that have booked direct, some commercial customers, some through travel agents. So that isn't.
Just to clarify, you don't give any preference to people who book directly.
There's no
way within the ground handling system they have visibility of how somebody's booked. They just look like an EasyJet customer, and the majority have booked direct anyway. But there is no way for them to be able to know how the booking channel that they came through. They just have the customer's contact details.
On when people have their flights cancelled, I think, is it right to say all three companies here do a voucher by default? Is that your first option? If you do a voucher by default, is there a time limit to when people can use that voucher from organisations?
Okay, so no, if we cancel your flight, you're offered refund, rebook, or another airline. So yeah, if all the flights that we have cancelled, if someone wants the money back, they'll get an automatic refund, not a voucher.
Yeah, and we offer them the choice of what they want to do, whether they want to refund, rebook or voucher. The vouchers, we have been extending the validity dates. They're normally 12 months. We've been extending them during COVID, given that people haven't had the opportunity to use them. So we've been extending them beyond that.
What to what?
Up to 24 months, depending on when they were issued. Yeah.
And we've been given a refund plus the EU 261 compensation, but as I say, because we thought that the standard we offered in the May half term was below the standard we expected, we offered an additional goodwill gesture. So that voucher was an additional over and above the legal minimum, and that is eligible for any alternative flight or any future TUI holiday.
There's no time limit to it?
Not that I'm aware of. I'm not able to confirm.
Just one last question, Julie, picking up something which you said earlier on. You said that you've already cancelled about 80 flights a day.
Correct, that's about 10% capacity.
Yeah, but we've already heard there's 114 flights that are being cancelled at the moment. Obviously, that's still a significant number and a big difference between 80 and 114. Why haven't you already cancelled more on your routes? To stop people going through that sort of heartache if you can't service it.
Yeah, that's exactly why we cancelled 10% of our capacity.
But do you need to cancel more because there's still flights being cancel?
Yeah, so I think as Sophie explained as well, so sometimes there's on-the-day problems that are outside of our control, for example, staff sickness, air traffic control, weather. So, you know, we built more resilience into the system by taking capacity out, but there are still some inevitable circumstances that happen on the day. There's a whole delicately tuned infrastructure, and that means, unfortunately, some days we do have to take on the day cancellations, but what we're trying to do is plan as far ahead as we can to make sure that we minimise that happening. And so if you look at the
So the 80 flights, the ones we've already cancelled, so the 114 cancelled today are in addition to, let's say, 80 flights that have been cancelled?
No. So I think this is where it does get quite confusing when you...
Is it 34 flights that are cancelled today then?
When you give a running commentary. So I can double check the number of flights that were cancelled today, but 114 flights were not cancelled today.
I'm trying to get, sorry, maybe my ignorance, is trying to get how many flights do people think they're going to get today and they're not flying today? Because if you already cancelled 80, you said you cancelled 80 in May, so people would know that. And that's still a significant number of flights that are not flying. If you're already happy to cancel some routes, why aren't you cancelling more in advance?
Yeah, so we are...
Or if you can't fulfil them?
Yeah, we are cancelling. So it is quite complicated. So to be honest, I can completely understand why people feel confused. But we are cancelling in advance. So we're not waiting until the day to make sure that basically the flight is cancelled on the day. So we proactively look in at the resource and the capacity. And we give
so Sophie talked to us about how many flights were cancelled today. How many flights were cancelled today or yesterday for British Airways?
So I'm sorry, I don't have that figure in front of me, but I will write to you and I'll explain what the breakup is between how many were cancelled in advance and give you...
How many cancelled last week?
So overall, we've cancelled 6,500 flights, which is around 80 per day, but they've been done in advance. So
6,000 last week? Sorry, Sophie managed to give us the breakdown of exactly how many flights were cancelled and for the right reasons. British Airways, which is meant to be national carriers, coming here, and you're not telling me how many flights are cancelled or why they're cancelled.
So I can write to the committee to give the exact breakdown, but I can tell you that we took out 10% of our...
So basically you don't know how many flights today, yesterday, this week are cancelled, and you're expecting the public to have confidence in that. And you say, well, earlier on in your evidence, you also said that one of the reasons for cancelling flights is because people are unsure and also to rebuild the industry and there's uncertainty. Your words, rebuild uncertainty, where people wanted to work in the build industry. What certainty can you give people to come and work for British Airways if you don't yourself know how many flights are going to be cancelled or whether they're going to be servicing flights or not? Surely there's confusion at all levels in British Airways.
So, look, I don't think there's confusion at all levels. We've taken proactive action to take out 10% of our schedule.
It's not working, is it? Still cancelling?
So we have cancelled flights in order to build in that operational resilience, and that has led to far fewer on-the-day cancellations than other airlines.
Okay, thank you very much. Charlotte Nichols, lastly, please.
Thank you, Chair. I've been contacted by a constituent of mine who I'll call Darren, who has seen a number of... Pardon?
Sorry, I said it's unlikely. Sorry, carry on.
It's not this Darren. But yes, so a constituent called Darren who I've been contacted by, who has seen a number of friends and family who have booked through TUI, had their flights cancelled at very short notice, including people who were taken off flights that they'd been boarded onto. He says, is there anything that the government can do to take TUI to task? I'm amazed that they're allowed to get away with what they're doing. I find it really poor that holidaymakers are left to fend for themselves when having to find new flights and hotels because of these cancellations, as there are no TUI reps to be seen. And the final insult when trying to get your refunds and compensation is that it's not only taking an age, but people are being told on emails saying, sorry, we can't find you on the manifest. It's deeply hurtful what they're putting people through with no care at all. We pay huge amounts and take time off work for our holidays for just a company to cancel them sometimes at a minute's notice. Now, Darren is due to be going on holiday soon himself. What assurances can you give him and other travellers from Warrington who'll be leaving from Manchester or Liverpool airports, or perhaps going to other airports in other parts of the country, that their holidays will be going ahead and that the failures that we've seen over recent months won't be repeated?
As I said, we had one very difficult weekend. I cannot apologise enough for the late cancellations and the service that we provided that weekend. The whole organisation is now galvanised to put in the resilience so that we do not have a repeat of that situation. We put in, I'm sure that was at Manchester Airport, we put in what I call a fire break, where we immediately cancelled 43 flights a week in Manchester in advance through the month of June, because we needed to be confident we could operate, and that the baggage system in particular at Manchester was one of the primary causes for the delay, because the bags couldn't be loaded before the crew went out of hours because there was such a delay in loading the bags. We learnt our lesson. We're building more resilience in terms of things that we can influence. We're working incredibly closely with Swissport to improve the situation across the whole UK, but particularly in Manchester. I think the confidence you can have is things are getting better. So Swissport said earlier, one of their challenges was that a high proportion of their staff did not have full security clearance. They only had this escorted security clearance. That is getting better. So that situation in the baggage handling at Manchester is getting better. The airlines, TUI and all the other airlines are getting their cabin crew through the security clearance. So in TUI, we will be fully staffed by the end of this month to operate the programme. So I think a lot is happening and working. But that said, we will put all those measures in for this summer. At the end of the summer season, we will do another review, looking back at the season and saying, how can we plan this differently or better for a subsequent year in all those operating points. We've got to learn from this. The whole industry's got to learn. I mean, the UK travel industry, as people said before, is a world-beating industry. But if we're going to keep it that way, every part of this ecosystem needs to improve, and we all need to work together to really make that happen.
So a quick yes/no question before I go back to the chair for each of you. Are you confident that your customers who have booked for July and August can be assured that their flights will be going ahead? If I could start with you, Mr. Burling.
I am absolutely confident that we are putting every effort in to minimise what we can, but we don't control every element of the system. If there's strikes and major air traffic control issues, that would affect every airline. But I am absolutely confident we are doing everything we can to make sure those holidays go ahead.
Ms. Decker?
Yeah, exactly the same point. We're controlling what we can control, but we're also building in a buffer to make sure we allow for those things that are external factors, that we now can take the lessons learnt from the last few weeks that haven't been good enough to make sure we project those forward. And if that means we need more people, or it means we need to take flying out, that's something we'll keep under review as we go forward. The key thing is we want to do anything we want to do to give people certainty for their summer holidays. Absolutely 100% yeah.
Ms. Trumbull?
Yeah, exactly the same as my colleagues. We want to build resilience into the system. We want to do everything that we can to get as many people aware as possible, and we'll continue to be galvanised to make sure that happens over the summer.
Thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Okay, thank you to all three of you for your contributions. As I say, we'll be welcoming the CEO of British Airways in a couple of weeks, and we will extend an invite to his counterpart at EasyJet as well, and we hope that your colleague gets better soon, Ms. Decker. So thank you to the three of you for giving your answers to us this morning. We're now moving to the final panel for today, where we are welcoming Robert Court, who is the Aviation Minister, and Richard Moriarty, the Chief Executive of the regulator, the Civil Aviation Authority. So we'll just allow people to hand over.
In West Farm?
One of us. Two people. Two soldiers in Ukraine or British.
Hi there, thanks. Let everybody get comfortable. Great. Well, Minister, Mr. Moriarty, thank you for coming to see us this morning. We appreciate you coming and answering our questions. As you all know, this is a one-off session for us, although there'll be a supplementary session with some of the CEOs that couldn't be available to speak to us this morning. And our primary issues are around labour market shortages. We have an adjacent inquiry on the UK labour market, and also the enforcement of consumer rights legislation in the airline industry. Minister, we've heard from all of our panels so far that essentially it is labour market shortages at the heart of all of the problems with flight cancellations and delays at the moment. Obviously, that's been predominantly with a focus on COVID, a bit on Brexit and the flow of European workers into the UK. And so I just want to ask you questions about those two answers from the previous panels. Pretty much everybody said that the travel restrictions during the COVID period and the way that furlough was extended or not extended in a timely fashion had implications for the companies being able to keep their staff or make them redundant, and then that's having a direct impact on their ability to fly planes today. Do you agree with that?
Well, firstly, I think the first point to make is this has been an exceptionally difficult time for the aviation sector. I mean, I have enormous sympathy with the difficult decisions they've had to make, because they've had to look at the viability of their businesses and then, in many cases, keep operating and then look to grow in the future, and particularly to grow under circumstances when neither they nor anyone else knows at what rate the demand would come back. So what we've tried to do is to give support to the sector to enable it to maintain a level of service and then to be in the position to bounce back when the time came. And the most important thing that, from my perspective, has been to make sure that they can keep flying again as soon as possible. That as soon as we're able to remove the restrictions, I know how difficult they've been, none of us wanted to be in that position, of course, to remove those restrictions, then get people flying again. That is the most important thing. With regards to, so I say that in the spirit of understanding the difficulties they've had. It's been very difficult. What rate is demand going to come back at? That said, it's a privately run industry, of course, and it's the responsibility of the sector to ensure that it has the people throughout the entirety of the aviation ecosystem to be able to operate the flights that they are offering for sale.
And on Brexit, I can't remember the figures that Simon Calder gave us earlier, but there was a certain percentage of workers who tended to be European migrants working in the UK, and that's had a significant impact. Do you agree with that?
I think that is not likely, and I say that for two reasons primarily. Firstly, that this seems to be a global problem. I've seen the evidence that you've had, and it's my understanding too. Schiphol, for example, as we've seen in the news, has had a major problem. There have been similar problems in Dublin and France, and also in the United States. So it tends to suggest this is a global issue, which is caused by a number of factors, multiplicity of factors, but fundamentally, if I were to put it in a sentence, it's the close down of a sector and then having to open it up again with all of the disruption that inevitably causes. So I think unlikely, and the reason I say that is that you wouldn't expect that same to be, if there were aviation workers spare on the continent of Europe, you'd expect them to be in Schiphol, for example, and solving that issue, and that isn't happening. And similarly, we see the same thing in the United States. So I think unlikely. The second reason for that is that I'm conscious that with the HGV issue, much similar points were made. And we made available 5,000 visas to enable HGV drivers to come, and I think it's 27 were taken up. In any rate, not very many. So all of those factors tend to suggest, I mean, it's impossible for me to prove a negative, of course, isn't it, Chairman? But on the evidence that we have, it does look as if Brexit has little, if anything, to do with it.
And so where there have been requests for changes to the immigration rules, you will not be taking those offers up from the industry?
Well, for the reason given, Chair, it doesn't seem that would be effective. There's a number of steps we can take and we will look to take, but that's one that, for the reason I've given, it doesn't seem to be effective. I would expect those workers to go to Schiphol before.
How do we evidence that? Because if employers, or some employers, are saying it would be helpful to employ more European workers, and then you're saying actually it's not helpful for them to do that, what's the evidence? Where do we check the numbers? How do you have confidence that European migration flows are not a problem for aviation workers?
Well, there clearly are data sets that underpin this, but
Which ones do you look at in the department?
Well, do you want to come into this? I'll come
sure.
into
yeah.
If I may. Well, if I may, just before I hand over to Richard, but just there is, I think the common sense observation of the market is quite a good one. It's an understandable reaction for an employer to say, if only I had access to this greater talent pool, the issue would be solved. But for the reason I've given, I don't think that talent pool is there, because we're seeing this as a global problem and one that we see very much writ large in Europe as well. And so if those workers existed in Europe, I would expect there not to be a problem at Schiphol.
We're all about evidence as well as common sense on this committee, and I've just been told we were told 30% were EU workers before Brexit. So I'm just keen, and we will ask them as well, but I'm keen to see if there's any data to underpin this argument one way or the other. I mean, Richard, did you say you had something on this?
If I may, I mean, in the UK over the half-term and Jubilee period, roughly between 2 and 4% of total flights were cancelled in the UK. That compares to a normal run rate of cancellations of about 1%. So that's clearly distressing, it's clearly unacceptable, and we want to make sure that we've got a grip to get it back to normal levels. But if we look at comparable other countries, their cancellation rates over the same period were equally high. France was 3%, and the Netherlands, which you heard earlier on around Schiphol Airport, was 11%. And as the Minister suggested, we're also picking up high numbers in both Dublin and North America as well. So this is not solely a UK-specific issue.
Okay, thank you. Ruth Cadbury?
Yes, I mean, you've told... sorry, I'm here from the Transport Committee. I'm guesting today. I've heard you say many, many times in answer to questions about COVID support being adequate for aviation, but aviation got 8 billion, but of course that was the same as all sectors in terms of furlough and loans and so on. And many of us were, as the chairman of the Transport Committee said, you can't just flick on aviation like a switch. It needs a lead-in. And there were, from across the board, representatives saying that there should have been specific support to retain and bring back staff in aviation in order to allow for the lead-in. Why didn't that happen?
Well, you're right. You have made that point before. We have had this conversation before, and of course you know, and forgive me, but I will of course quote that £8 billion of support that the government gave. And it's because the government overarchingly took that approach of not of sector-specific support, but support to the whole economy, no matter what the industry was. And that of furlough, of course, and a UK EIF and the loans are a classic example of that. So yes, that support was there. There were also things like the ground handlers, the airports and ground handlers business rate scheme, so there was that provided as well, specifically to two of the sectors that are most impacted with the topic that the committee is concerned with today. And that took care of, I think I'm right in saying, the business rates liabilities of all but the very largest of airports. So that was very much there. But then you get to the stage of the restart, and from government's perspective, my job, it seems to me, is the best thing that I can do for the sector is to enable it to operate again. They had been prevented from flying for understandable public health reasons, but prevented from flying nonetheless. The sooner I can remove those restrictions, which I am glad to report we did, and we were a leading country in doing it, the better for this industry. We're then in the position of understanding at what rate the demand will come back. And as I started by saying in answer to the chairman, I have enormous sympathy for the sector as they're trying to understand at what rate it's going to come back. And it is difficult when you deal with this extremely uncharted territory. But it is the responsibility of the sector at the end of the day to look at how many tickets it is offering for sale, how many it can service, and to ensure that the people that it needs are in place, or if not in place, to adjust operations accordingly. And that, Chairman, is going to be a major focus for us going forward. I have been engaged in this issue, as you would expect, for a long time. We may go into this in due course, and some of the steps government has taken. But going forward, I will be scrutinising those plans on a very regular basis, weekly, chaired by myself and also officials at the same time.
Okay. And if I've still got the floor, I've got two further questions. One is on, I mean, a number of members may still have questions of you around the package of support for passengers when their flights are cancelled or delayed over a long period. Are you looking, as Simon Calder said at the beginning, one of the few advantages of leaving the EU is that you can move away from the EU 261 compensation scheme. Would you be looking to improve it, strengthen it, or what? Or not change it at all and retaining as it is?
So there are a number of good points there, and there's a number of advantages from not being members of the European Union in the aviation sector. We've taken advantage of a number of them, but perhaps park that for another day or for another question. But in terms of rights and consumer rights, yes, we've just closed a consultation on this. We are looking to learn the lessons from COVID, also make use of the freedoms that we now have, and to ensure that we have a compensation regime and a consumer rights regime that really works for us. We will in due course be saying more about that, so I can't go into it in too much detail at the moment because we're considering the consultation responses. We've mentioned in our recent strategy, Flight Path to the Future, that it's something that we will be looking at. But one of the things in particular will be around assisting the CAA with their enforcement powers, and that's something we are interested in.
Okay, and one further question to the CAA. Security vetting, you're primarily responsible for the vetting of staff who need airside clearance. What are you doing to speed up the turnaround time, and what else can other authorities do? I gather we've got some movement with HMRC.
I recognise this question. There is some confusion, I think, in the system about where the blockages are. There are actually two checks that need to be done. There's a check that we and government partners do, security clearance, and actually the turnaround times there are as good, if not better, than they were pre-pandemic. Where the blockages tend to be is in a different part of the system, which is the employer background checks, the things that the airport and airlines need to do. And this is about getting the employment history of people over the last 5 years. And as you can imagine, the last 5 years have been very difficult for many people. So getting those...
HMRC are now...
Correct, and that's a decision that the Minister took recently.
Thank you. It just may be appropriate, Chairman, if I were to answer this. This is one of the issues that was raised. I have ongoing discussions with the sector. I have done all the way through COVID. I'm sure I said to you before in the TSC hearing, I have an open door policy. And so numerous meetings and a number of issues always been raised. In the course of the restart planning, this issue was one of the ones that was raised by the sector because it's 5 years reference checks that have to be done. And in order to, what could we do to help with that? So we engaged with our colleagues at Treasury to enable a letter to be provided, which it requires, which gives that in one go and lays it out, rather than having to go to all of the individual employers, which clearly is very time-consuming. Jim, I hope you'll forgive me for just stressing that for a moment, because it really is something that will help. Now, it will help perhaps more in the medium term in terms of bringing more people on board, which is very much needed. But it is a good example of, we work very closely with the sector, of us holding meetings, holding engagement, listening to them and acting and delivering on the things that they've asked for.
Thank you. Richard Fuller, please.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, just on the sort of let's blame Brexit line of argument we've heard, perhaps you can clarify for me, when it comes to being a baggage handler or a member of the check-in staff or a member of the cabin crew, is a Filipino up to that standard? Is Brazilian? Is someone from South Africa, or can we only have white Europeans?
Absolutely right. We are interested in the people with the best talents from wherever in the world they come from.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Moriarty, earlier, the representative for Which gave the impression, certainly to me, that the CAA was a bit of a soft touch when it comes to the airlines, ignoring your warnings over potential for excessive delays, perhaps them not enforcing strongly enough the responsibility for booking passengers on a first available flight. What do you say to that concern?
I could answer that in two parts. With the powers that we've got, we are among, if not the most assertive regulator in Europe for upholding consumer rights, and we have got a track record of taking airlines to court. I think Simon Calder mentioned earlier a long-running case we have with Ryanair, which is before the Supreme Court, having won the case at the Court of Appeal and the High Court. So we have a track record of taking airlines to task when it comes to consumer rights. Where I profoundly agree with both Which and Simon earlier is I think history has attested that our powers are weak in the modern circumstances of aviation. And that's why we really welcome the Minister's consultation at the turn of this year, which is opening up a debate about how to improve our powers. They are quite cumbersome, and it takes us a long time to go through court processes to get remedy. So this is where we do fundamentally agree with Which and Simon from earlier. But within the powers that we've got, we are very much making sure that airlines do what they're supposed to do.
Just on that very specific point about responsibility for a first available flight rebook for passengers, are you saying that at the moment the CAA can't really help very much because you need the changes, or is there anything you're practically doing now in terms of moral persuasion on the companies, if nothing else?
Yes, we do a lot of that. We do a lot of informal influence, particularly with the chief executives of the major airlines. So there was a case recently with EasyJet's IT failure, where initially its position was that that was extraordinary circumstances. We intervened and said, look, that really can't be the case. And they changed, to be fair to them, they changed very quickly. So we do that. We issue guidance. The other thing we do is use our social media channels to get as much information out to consumers as possible. So in the last 10 days or so, our information on passenger rights has been viewed by over 500,000 consumers. What that tells me is, it's good that we've got that social media presence, but actually there's a real appetite and desire for people to know their rights. And I think this is an area where I'm keen to press the airlines harder, because I think they should step up to the plate and provide more information to consumers on what their rights are.
Okay. Minister, back in January, you recognised there were problems in the consumer policies and within the aviation sector, and launched a consultation. I don't think you published those findings yet, but can you give us a general sense of where you see the direction of travel in the future in terms of consumer rights policy in the aviation sector?
Yes, we will publish our response. Forgive me if I don't know the exact date, but it's not far off now. It'll be some weeks away, as we're still considering those. One focus of it will be ensuring that the CAA have the powers that they need, because if they have the moral powers, that of course have been referred to, but then you're looking at court proceedings, which of course are lengthy and long, and there are some mid-range powers that would be of assistance. So we're very much looking at that. We're also looking at fundamentally making sure that this is a sector that really works for consumers, that consumers are able to look at it and understand what their rights are. So the information piece that Richard's talked about is also quite important for us as well. We're looking at publishing a passenger charter, for example, to make clear to consumers so they can understand on a one-stop shop basis what their rights are in certain circumstances, so that it's clear and it's open. So more information up front, very much consumer-centred.
And what about automatic compensation for extensive delays?
It's something we'll consider. We'll have to look at it and understand how it would work and the impact that it would have on the sector.
And when we spoke to Which, from your overview, would you say that's right, that some airlines currently are performing significantly better with the problem set that they have than other airlines? And what would you say are the lessons that you've seen could be learned?
The analysis that I think Simon Calder gave in the first session is one that I would share. There are some airlines that have fared better in the last few weeks than others, and there's a range of reasons behind that. And the airlines that he name-checked, I would agree with his list. What I would say is that we are keeping on top of the airlines at the moment to make sure that they are paying the refunds back as quickly as they can, and certainly within the 7 days. What they've all done, and I think this is a learning from the pandemic where, frankly, we were not in a great place with the airlines and we had to take action, but they have learned. They are automatically reversing the payments, so people are getting their cash back for the refund very quickly, as Simon, I think, mentioned first thing this morning.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Paul Howell, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to go back to the security pass dialogue that took place a few minutes ago. In the last session, the operators were telling us that would be something good to happen. From what I understood a few minutes ago from yourself, Minister, it's already happened in terms of access to HMRC and things like that. How come they wouldn't know that if that's the case that we're at that stage?
I think it's because, as Mr Moriarty has said, there's some conflation of the two parts of the responsibility here. There is the part that government is responsible for, the issuing of initial security passes is the responsibility of Cabinet Office and CAA. There is no backlog. Those are proceeding and within the timescale that would be accepted.
The specific dialogue, though, in the previous session was about access to HMRC records to enable, visibility of continuity of employment and things like that. They were saying that would be a useful thing to happen. What I understood was that you're saying it's
I think they may be asking for more. What we have done is a great deal. Rather than them having to make individual employer checks, we're enabling a potential employee to access their employment history and to provide it in a letter. They may be asking for more than that, which is...
I think they were asking for direct access.
For direct access, well, that would be very difficult for data protection reasons. It's not something that is open normally. If you think about it, it would mean that your potential employer could access your tax history and your employment history. So there's a significant data protection issue there. And I don't know that it really takes you much further than what we've already done, which is to enable you as a potential employee to access your employment history clearly, quickly, simply, easily, provide it in one sheet and then give it to the potential employer.
It sounds to me as though there is some sort of a disconnect, though, and that maybe that there's a comms required to those operators to make sure that they know that they can inform the individuals that they can get this one sheet thing. It seems as though the individuals were still looking for their own step-by-step approach.
I'm certainly happy to take that away.
I think that might be worth as a better comms out, if I could ask you to
happy
consider
to
that.
take away and ensure that isn't the case.
As a follow-up question to that, you said earlier that you had the open door policy and you had lots of dialogue going on. Are there any other things that either you think the department could be doing now to improve and mitigate or find a way through some of these backlogs for the operators, or that you've seen that the operators should actually be picking up and doing something about?
Yeah. So with the caveat that, of course, this is a privately run sector and it's not one that government directly controls, and it's one that's been very successful by adopting that model. But with that caveat, there are things that the department can do, has been doing and will continue to do to cajole, encourage, support, engage to see if there's anything else that we can do that might assist on an ongoing basis. So, for example, there is a joint ministerial working group on borders where I meet with the security minister and with sector to work on the incoming side of things. That's with regard to border force. I think we've particularly been concerned with the outgoing side in this committee, but that's the other side of it, which has been a concern, and I think we're seeing the fruits of some of the work that we're doing there. And then there is the strategic risks group, which will be, I alluded to it earlier, it will be chaired by me on a weekly basis. That is on top of a summer resilience group, which is chaired equally weekly by senior officials. So those are 2 high-level meetings per week with the sector when we will be going through what their plans are, when we will be going through the hiring position, the numbers, what their plans are for operations as well. And then last but by no means least is the airport partners working groups, which were set up again as a result of some engagement that I did, which is the airports themselves working with the other moving pieces. Because although I, for the reasons of ease of expression, talk about the sector, in reality it's a complicated picture. Any one airport will include the airport, ground handlers, and there may well be more than one, and then airlines, and there are of course more than one of those. So, and that is before you start getting into other things like transport to the airport. So that's looking at the very local ecosystem around an airport to make sure that is joined up in the way that it should be. So from a convening and perspective, yes, but not forgetting that ultimately this is the responsibility of the sector to ensure that if it offers a flight for sale, that it's able to operate it.
Okay, and just to move the conversation to a slightly different place, Chair. Obviously, one of the things we've seen is operators, particularly airlines, because they're the front and central of this, letting their customers down. In a marketplace, that normally means that you end up with competitive change because one supplier is doing better than another. Customers take choices. One of the problems with the airlines industry is slots and allocation and things like this, which means that it's very difficult for new entrants to get into the slots. Are there any views about the actual structure of the industry that you think are worth taking with the learnings that have come from what's happened over recent months, to open that up. And I'd like you to also cover the resilience of long haul versus short haul and slot allocation.
So only a few weeks ago we published a document called Flight Path to the Future, which is the aviation strategy that Ruth will be very familiar with. It's been renamed Flight Path to the Future for ease of expression. But that fundamentally is the aviation strategy, which is a framework document for the future. It builds on some of the consultation responses that were in Aviation 2050, which was the green paper from a few years ago now, but clearly it's been updated because the world has changed to a certain extent at least. And that covers a number of things. It covers things like regional aviation, the health and the growth prospects for regional aviation, as well as things like Jet Zero, of course, a whole other topic, but nonetheless an important one. And it also includes slots as well. So we'll look to consult on that later in the year. It's a complicated issue, but we'll be having a look at that too.
Thank you very much. Minister, you talked about the Summer Resilience Committee. Will all of this be fixed in time for people's summer holidays?
We will do everything that we can in conjunction with the sector to make the experience one that is smooth, that is enjoyable, to get people out and about flying. So that's exactly what we all want to see as a global country.
Very good. And my last question to either of you, depending on who wants to ask it, I still don't really understand why some airlines are fine and some airlines are not fine. We've been told that British Airways in particular has a big problem on cancellations, EasyJet in second place. EasyJet has a bigger problem in terms of notifying customers at the airport as opposed to in advance, but Ryanair seems to be fine, Jet2 seems to be fine. Do either of you have an assessment as to why BA and EasyJet are in a worse position than other airlines?
Without wishing to sound as if I'm on the fence, it is complicated for the simple reason.
That is the fence, Minister.
I'm going to be on the fence.
That's a fence.
I mean, do you have a view that you'd like to share or not?
It's complicated because, and I just want to explain it a little bit, simply because you are dealing with an airline that may have different ground handlers at different places. Those ground handlers may be in a different position. They may, some of them, be hit by illness, for example. They all will have different impacts. So it isn't, I'm not wishing to be evasive, perhaps is a better word than being on the fence. I'm not wishing to be evasive, just to explain that it's a complicated ecosystem and all of those factors will be impacting on the performance of individual airlines.
And from a civil aviation authority perspective, Mr. Moriarty, if we talk about the energy sector, we expect the energy regulator to know how well run certain energy companies are in comparison to others and to maybe let us know about concerns about how the leaders are running their business, their financial position, their compliance with the law. Presumably you do that for the airlines. Do you have any particular concerns as the regulator about British Airways and EasyJet compared to, say, Ryanair or Jet2?
There's three principal things that we look at: safety, security and consumer rights. So they're the three things that we're prioritising. And at the moment, I wouldn't differentiate between the airlines. They are really good on safety and security. Long may that remain. And on consumer rights, actually, compared to the start of the pandemic, I have seen them lean forward, particularly with the auto payments of refunds, to try and get that money back to consumers as soon as possible. And we will make sure that they do the right thing. So I would certainly support the view. It is a complicated picture. Different business models entered the pandemic in different shapes and different sizes. And actually comparing short haul to long haul is another differentiator. So it's not easy just to pull out one particular argument for why some airlines are doing better than others.
Okay, well, unfortunately we've timed out, so that will be the end for today. So thank you to the Minister, thank you Mr. Moriarty for coming. We'll now call this session to an end. Order.
The proceeding